Hey up YouTube, how at? Today we'n do something a bit different. A bit more of a serious video in plain English. Well, for the most part. The other day I dug out my old copy of Arfur in Staffordshire by Alan Povey and Andy Riddler, and on the opening pages is a map of Neck district. Now for those that don't know, that covers the whole of the south of Stoke-on-Trent and its surrounding area. With the centenary of Stoke-on-Trent coming up, I thought it'd be nostalgic to take a look at the places marked on this map, whether they're still there, and what became of them if they're not. As you can see, the map's pretty big, so we'll start at the very centre, looking at Neck itself. Don't worry, I plan to cover the whole map over a few instalments, so please do remember to subscribe so you don't miss them. Right, let's crack on then, shall we? So let's start off with Neck itself. Neck is an affectionate local nickname for Longton. An example of the down-to-earth humour of its people, I think. The area we now call Longton was actually a smaller hamlet that was adjoined by another called Lane End, or originally Mere Lane End, because it was the end of the turnpike lane that came from Mere. Funnily enough, Lane End actually comprised of what is now Longton town centre, and Longton was originally the more rural area centred around Longton Hall. The two merged after significant expansion in the Victorian era, and locals gradually started referring to the area as Longton, dropping Lane End altogether, even as early as the 1840s. They officially merged into the borough of Longton in 1865. The name Neck End is probably a tongue-in-cheek corruption of Lane End that just lived on. Residents of a certain age still refer to themselves as Neck Enders to this day. Moving on, we come to the area just outside Longton, called Nouk. Now Nouk was on Ethcote Road, heading towards Longton Hall. It was a very impoverished area in the early 20th century, with very poor quality housing, most of which has since been replaced, and it originally housed workers of Longton Hall Colliery, and its associated furnaces and brickworks in the 19th century. All were relatively short-lived, changing hands a few times over a period of 30 years or so, before closing completely in 1897. The Red House was once the main pub in this area, and it's now a bike shop. Moving up from Nouk, we come to Furrester's Chimney. Now this local landmark belonged to the Phoenix Works, which was located on King Street between Longton and Fenton. The chimney was known as Furrester's Chimney, named after Thomas Furrester, who founded the works in 1879, and it formed a significant part of the Longton skyline. In 2025, it's still there, along with the accompanying bottle ovens that it served, and it's a Grade 2 listed building. You can see it peeking out over the surrounding office and commercial buildings after you go under the railway bridge towards Fenton. You can also see it on the left as you go down Baths Road past the big Tesco, towards the train station. Now going down below the Nook, we come to Longton Symmetry. A classic example of a Potteries pronunciation sounded like a completely unrelated word in the English language. The dead centre of Longton, so to speak, is still very much an active cemetery, although I can't vouch for how symmetrical it is. Sadly, the historic chapel's now fallen into disrepair, and there have been a few different local campaigns to try and preserve it. From the dead centre, we'll move on to a place that was very much the centre of life in Longton town centre, Ddewd Ut. Ddewd Ut was a notoriously rough-around-the-edges working-class pub, real name George and Dragon. It was one of many pubs along the Strand back in the day, and it's more or less the last man standing in that regard, now a more modern sort of sports bar type pub. It features prominently in the stories of Our Grandad Pigott, where it was frequented by a lot of rather dubious local characters. Heading down the road, we come to Waterloo. The Waterloo was another pub on Longton Strands that's since been repurposed, this time into a cafe. It joins the long list of pubs that have found a new life in Longton. I made a video about this on my other channel. I'll add a link to that at the end if you'd like to watch it. Next we're heading down towards Longton's Times Square, which easily trumps its New York counterpart in every single possible measure. Looking across Times Square, we come to Caroline Street. Now Caroline Street is still a popular rat run in Longton, though many attempts have been made over the years to stop it being used that way. It used to be the site of the Roebuck pub, which has now been converted into offices, though the remains of the sign are still outside. Staying on Times Square, near the bottom of Caroline Street, we come to the Crown and Ancker, now known as the Crown Hotel, and has been for a lot of its history. This hotel was once the place for the more distinguished gentlemen of Longton. It's a bit rough around the edges these days, like a lot of things in Stoke, but nonetheless it's still there, and it's still a hotel. Actually, I recently found out one of my distant ancestors had a cottage on the land that's now owned by the Crown Hotel back in the 1700s. Bit of useless information for you there. Next, we'll head up Market Street until we come to Bonk. Renamed Bridgewood Street in the 1950s, it was historically called Wharf Street, but it's always been known to the locals as Bonk, or Engine Bank. This street was thick in the industrial heartland of Longton, and is bisected by the railway, which is possibly where its nickname came from. These days the area around the street's quite run down, but it's still largely made up of industrial and commercial units. The railway line still runs over it too on the way to Derby. Just underneath Bonk, we've got the interestingly named Monkey's Island. Now, this was a local nickname for the area around East Vale, which, much like the Nouk, was a very impoverished Victorian slum, made up of cramped and squalid terraced housing. It was cleared as part of the post-war social housing boom in the 50s and 60s, with many residents gratefully relocated to the more modern council houses off Longton Hall Road. The somewhat snobbish nickname likely referred to the squalid and overcrowded living conditions, with barely a few feet of space between the rows of houses. Though another source I found suggested that Monkey's Island actually referred to a turntable used for shunting coal trucks down to the railway on Bonk. If anyone knows more about this, feel free to mention it in the comments. Last but not least, we'll head to just outside Longton now, towards Florence Pit. A large colliery, found in its namesake area just outside of Nouk, Florence Pit was one of the largest employers in the area. Named after the 3rd Duke of Sutherland's eldest daughter, and built on land belonging to Trentham Hall, the pit opened in 1874. The pit eventually merged underground with Hemheath Colliery in the 1970s, to form a super pit. Florence Pit closed in 1994, with Hemheath following 3 years later, being one of the last pits in the area to close. I vaguely remember being taken into the boiler house as a lad by a friend of my grandma who'd worked there all of his life. The winding gear and other buildings remained for quite some time until they were cleared to make way for the housing estate that now occupies the site. So that wraps it up for episode 1. I hope you enjoyed this little tour around Neck End and District. Please leave a comment with your memories of the area, and any other notable locations you feel have been missed from this map. As I said, I'll be covering the whole of this map in subsequent episodes, so don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss it. And I'll see thee soon.